we have some time for a question. Richard, if I might start off, what's comes across loud and clear in your presentation is that the major cultural change was the realization that cancer research should be part of the healthcare system as opposed to being something separate from the healthcare system. Is that the correct take?
Oh yes, I mean I think that was one of the key breakthroughs, and it really only occurred to the leaders in oncology first. It wasn't that the Department of Health recognized its importance, but they gradually came to see that after the system became successful. The other major impact, I think, was that the clinical oncology community there, of course, there's very little private oncology. It's an extremely minor influence in the country. And they were frustrated with the fact that they had limited ability to provide new agents or to move forward. And so when that was given to them, they really embraced it quite actively. So I think that was the other major factor.
Rich Shilsky, in transition to ASCO. So this question for Bob, you and or George about your new prioritization committee. I realize that the committee functions, not as a public committee, but I'm curious as to what you envision to be the public output of the committee's deliberations, particularly as it relates to your assessment of gaps in the scientific portfolio, because it would seem to me that where gaps are identified that presumably relate to unmet medical need or unmet research opportunity, that those should be broadly communicated to the research community so that steps can be taken to fill those gaps. And a corollary, in a sense, to that question then is whether it's would be the expectation that the scientific steering committees would then consider in their evaluation of new trial concepts the extent to which the trials are addressing the unmet needs identified in the prioritization process.
Yeah, I think it's important what you're saying in terms of eventually getting that message out. But I think in the system we're operating in and the way we're structured, I don't think it'll be a report from the working group, but rather working with the subcommittee of CTAC and with CTAC itself, that in turn will, as that one slide showed, come back to interact with in terms of making specific recommendations. That's certainly not our charter.
So of course CTAC is a public committee.
Yes, no, absolutely, but stating that the working group is really not a public committee.
Yeah, so though, Rich, in that regard, certainly we will be presenting to CTAC in the relatively near future some of our initial findings. And we'll certainly be in direct consultation with the working group steering committees to present our disease by disease findings.
Right, again, this is Sheila Pernula from NCI, and I do want to clarify that any of the recommendations and or the conclusions from the working group will be presented at public forums, being CTAC. So the information will be available to the public. It is just not complete at this point in time.
This isn't going to be some deep, dark secret.
I just had a question, Rick, in terms of how about the ability to do the molecular studies and genomic studies within the UK structure? Is there is that really available? I know there's a support for the actual conduct of the clinical studies.
Yes, it is becoming much more widely available. Cancer Research UK has put forward a major initiative to build it up, starting with major centers where they're building that in, and eventually characterizing every new patient that comes through. But there is also a Department of Health initiative to do that. And even before those have come on board, we've actually been able to demonstrate our capacity to do that across a very large colorectal study which is going to be going on at least 70 or 80 institutions. So I think that it's now clearly moving forward. It's clearly seen as a priority to all of the funders that the studies build those mechanisms up as we go.
Let me ask how you got out of the silo business and into the collaboration business, because I mean, here the idea that the American Cancer Society, Komen, and the NCI would all sit down together to discuss prioritization of funding is something almost unimaginable. How did you pull off that?
Well, it wasn't me. No, I don't. I mean, this is a cultural difference question, I think, ultimately, and one of size. I do think, again, in the UK, if we're going to succeed, I think there's a wide recognition, including among the funders, that they're going to have to compete against much greater resources at other places, and they're going to have to achieve the numbers and finish off the trials in periods of time that are reasonable, or they're going to have to seek a lot of international collaboration. And it's not that they don't like to collaborate internationally, it's just that it's hard to do that and it delays the trials. So I think people recognize widely that this is the way forward. And when the NCRN started up and suddenly people were on the same page, I think they got used to being on the same page. They thought that was working nicely.
Yes, my name's Lou Pavia with the Education Network for Advanced Cancer Clinical Trials. And I'm wondering, in the prioritization, you identified 5 criteria that you use. Some of them sounded like they could be quite quantitative in nature, benefit per patient and those kinds of things. Did you actually use quantitative measures? And do you think that it's appropriate for sites to be doing the same thing on an annual basis, look at the portfolio that they're offering and evaluating that and refining that as well?
Well, yes, we did use quantitative measures. The years of life saved were based on calculations that said if you accepted the stats for the trial at their face value,
Sure.
in terms of what improvement was predicted, and then if you looked at the number of patients who in the applicable disease setting, how many years of life would be saved, it is a calculation which, while it's got its own complexities, is something that's widely applicable across diseases. So, yeah, that's a routine. That metric is a routine part of the evaluation.
And are those metrics going to be available? I mean, again, and the other half of my question is, it appropriate for sites to be looking at their portfolio and maybe creating a virtuous cycle of feedback to you?
You know, certainly I don't think there'd be any problem making it available. Now, I will also say that you have to approach this with some care, because one of the tensions one has is a very tiny advance in a really common disease will give you a much bigger pickup of years of life saved than a fairly large advance in a rare disease. And certainly the rare diseases deserve help too. So we don't want to suggest that this is the only metric that's valuable in terms of looking at these trials.
Thanks.
Richard Pastor, FDA. This is for Rick Kaplan. Could you talk about the characteristics of the studies and the types of studies that are done in these groups in England? Specifically, are they looking at, for example, unapproved drugs, or are these more trials trying to kind of redefine standards of care with already approved drugs? So are there fundamental differences from, for example, these trials that are being done in the groups versus what a drug company would do, for example?
There had been very substantial differences in, I'd say that up till 5 or 6 years ago, it really was very much a matter of perhaps minor refinements in the standard of care. And I think that has become not really easily fundable through, for instance, Cancer Research UK. There is a a grant stream within the NIHR, which still exists for that sort of thing, and it is used. And some of it is, I think, potentially very valuable in the life years sort of sense. But much of the thrust of the CSGs has actually been in new drug development, and we've got, as I say now, more than half of the phase 3 trials and virtually all of the phase 2 trials are with some level of pharma support, at least with novel agents that are not available. So that's really been a big shift in the portfolio.
Well, one of the reasons I'm asking this, obviously there is a lapse in time, and it could be quite significant between when NICE will provide funding for the drug. Is this a mechanism, and that's why we're getting such accrual to these trials, to get access to these drugs since they're not approved for commercialization in the UK? Or for reimbursement, I should say.
Well, you're absolutely right. That was one of the issues initially. I think very strong. I had NICE in there in one of my slides, but I took it out because in reality, over the last few years, there's been with the so-called Cancer Drugs Fund option, essentially the lag now between approval and access of patients to the drugs is only however long it takes the locality to decide they want to use the fund to support that drug. And so that's becoming something of a non-issue anymore.
Roy Herbst from Yale. I want to follow up on what Rick was asking earlier. So I think it's great the prioritization that's being done, and as soon as it can filter back to the committees to identify gaps, and there could be RFAs. But in the meantime, as these committees meet, and I'm actually on one of the committees for the disease types, is there any sense that there's a budget and that they have a certain number of studies that they can do, and if they approve one, that means another one won't get done? Because I did see this morning from what Jim was showing that about 50% of the studies are getting through. So I wonder, how are we going to filter this back to that committee where there really can be a prioritization at that level to try to do the most innovative studies?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question, Roy. But I think the purpose that we have right now will be really to, get through this whole process. I think eventually, hopefully, that's what will come out of this process, that we will be able to make recommendations. Obviously, the resources are limited, and as I mentioned, our committee really is not given the charter to really act on new studies, but rather on studies that that already are underway. Hopefully, again, though, through CTAC, and after that information comes in, that information will be utilized to help in the future in terms of making decisions with regard to studies, particularly as we hopefully identify better metrics.
Roy, we're not in charge of the NCI budget, though what we've been told is, first, from a resource standpoint, the basic resources or the basic cost of a trial is largely a function of A, how many patients go on the trial, and B, how long do you have to follow the patients on the trial. So that metric actually is part of our calculations. Now, going forward in the genomic era, where we're going to be having increasingly intense biomarker-driven sort of studies, then the question is, does the resource allocation change? And the answer is probably yes. We're assured money is fungible. If you want to do a smaller trial that has a significantly more intense biomarker basis rather than a large trial that is a stripped down, simple randomized control trial, that's certainly a possible thing to do.
And again, maybe going from the emphasis on the larger phase 3 studies to the nimble phase 2 studies will allow basically more of those type studies that are focusing on science to be implemented.
Excuse me, Nancy Roach, fight colorectal cancer. I have a question about the phase 2 versus phase 3 portfolio in the UK. It looked to me like you have a very small number of phase 2 trials and a large number of phase 3 trials, relatively speaking. Is that accurate?
Yeah, Nancy, that reflects, I think, that the mix of the older time period and the current time period. the program for the specific program for Syria to fund phase 2 trials, so-called feasibility trials, that just started about, I guess it started 5 years ago or 4 years ago. And so since that time, that's built up very substantially. Before it was negligible up to that point. And that is a sort of a cumulative slide that you saw. So the numbers are still much lower for phase 2 trials in the UK than here. I mean, every cancer center has certainly got lots of phase 2 trials here. And over there, most of the phase 2 trials, well, there'll be 4 or 5 major cancer centers that have quite a few of their own, and most of the others will be done collaboratively between several places. So the numbers are much smaller, but they are an increasing proportion of what we do and what we sort of define ourselves as doing.
So how do you, in the evaluation process, how do you take into the account the tension between an individual center that wants to accrue to its own phase 2 versus its participation in a national network on a large randomized phase 2 or phase 3?
We don't take account of it at all. In a sense, the centers that do a lot of phase 2s have never really changed their priorities very much with the establishment of NCRN. It's actually more the centers around them that are able to do large-scale trials or feed patients into those centers. And all of those, the places where those big centers are, all are doing very well on their numbers, so they're not worried about the tyranny of how they count things.
John Mendelson from MD Anderson. Just to follow up on the last few questions from this side of the room, I'm curious, one of your 5 criteria in the working group is the appropriateness for the NCTN program. I mean, we as a country are investing $150 million in an incredibly strong infrastructure. But on the other hand, we're hearing that about 1/3 of the costs of these trials come from the NCI, and about 1/3 come from companies, and then 1/3 comes from all the institutions that are participating in and pro bono giving their time and effort. And is your committee going to be trying to assess what's the optimal use of the cooperative groups? What kind of trials should feed in? I mean, one scenario that George sort of hinted at is phase 2 trials could go on anywhere. You find out that an ALK rearrangement inhibitor works in a phase 2 trial. You bash it right in quickly and get a huge phase 3 trial going and get it off to the FDA quickly, which is actually what happened. I don't know if that trial was through a cooperative group. What can we do with the cooperative groups that can't be done other ways? That's my question. Are you going to be able to address that?
Well, whether or not we can address it as a committee, I don't know. I mean, individually, of course, the way I would address it is to say we all know that there are clinical trials that will never be conducted by drug companies. Many of these trials involve other modalities such as surgery and radiation. Many of them involve looking at comparisons of older drugs with newer drugs when the company doesn't view themselves as benefiting from that comparison. And so by appropriateness, we're thinking in terms of trials that would not be conducted in the absence of a public system.
Right.
I think the other aspect also might be that not to have the focus only on large phase 3 studies in certain diseases, but rather to historically, much of the budget has been spent on a few different diseases and not really, perhaps by having a better handle on the metrics for the various diseases, not having studies, if they're not competing, at least are very, very close in terms of large phase 3 studies that are consuming a lot of funds.
Okay. Well, good luck with it.
Thank you, Steve Piantadosi, Cedars-Sinai. The question is for George and Bob. If you had a set of optimally designed clinical trials, it would not necessarily yield an optimal portfolio. And if you optimize a heterogeneous portfolio, it doesn't in any way mean that the individual trials within the portfolio are each optimal. And I think that's particularly a problem when the optimization is done on the basis of cost, as is what's fundamentally driving the current approach. So my question is, under that sort of stipulation, if there's a really important scientific innovative trial that has a very unusual signature with respect to the metrics that you've set up, are you certain that that trial would be selected? Would it rise to the top, and would it actually be done?
I mean, I think to focus the attention on the importance of those studies, I think one of the advantages of having this overview of all the trials is to bring the molecular and pathway biomarker-driven studies forward for strong consideration at the beginning as a recommendation to CTAC and then in turn to the steering committee.
By the way, the idea that the current system is driven primarily by the cost of the phase 3 trials, I think is something that we need to think about how we're going to change. I mean, we clearly live in an era of just unexcelled ability to apply emerging science to clinical trials. But we're not going to be able to do that if we continue to conduct 7,000 patient trials of toothpaste A versus toothpaste B. I mean, I think we all recognize that. So how we allocate in such a way to make use of that science is a challenge, not just for our committee, but for the entire system.
Yeah, I have a question for Rich, regarding Ray Petroshan, NCI, regarding biomarker-driven trials in the UK. Supporting stratification markers can be quite expensive. Is this normally picked up by the national healthcare system? And if so, how does it sort of work its way in a timely way to be sort of connected with the trial in the sense that the validation or standardization of the biomarkers?
You know, it's an excellent set of questions, really. First of all, the NHS as a whole is not picking up very many of these as we sit here today, but they have a program whereby they are trying to build the way to do that and build it into the NHS as a whole. I don't know how quickly that will proceed. I suspect there are plenty of hurdles in the way. But in the meantime, the research funders, including the other arm of the government that funds the trials themselves, is paying for that sort of resource. So we are building it into trials that we're doing. There's a major colorectal trial that we're about to launch that I'm involved with, which is carrying out a very extensive and comprehensive array of tests and signatures, and that will evolve as the trial goes on. And we built that into the research costs of the trial rather than into the NHS costs of the trial for the time being. And then we have been able to demonstrate that we can work through a couple of central labs to handle those specimens in a way which is timely enough for the particular trial we had in mind, and was almost timely enough for a trial where we were pushing it hard of the last generation. We almost made it on that one, but the point is it can be done now. It has to be very carefully managed. It isn't yet cost effective in the sort of way it would need to be to roll out, but we're simultaneously trying to build the systems for it to become so.
Thank you.
With that, we'll come to an end, and I thank our speakers.